This is the Wizard and Oz podcast, a future-focused show looking at current events and what we can do about them. I'm joined by the Wizard Tristan Barker, an infamous internet troll, turned investment banker, reformed fugitive, and indigenous environmentalist. Alongside him, Oz Sultan, a Republican district leader in Harlem, focused on clean tech and blockchain legislation. An American Muslim, he's also heavily focused on bridging the gap between faiths. My name is Lachlan. I'm a halal snack pack enthusiast. I'll take a moment to thank our first sponsor for this first episode of the Wizard and Oz podcast, Rocket Tech Support. Protect your computer, protect your community, protect your country. Gentlemen, thank you for joining on this first episode of the Wizard and Oz podcast. I'm really looking forward to the conversations that come out of this series. I think probably the best place to start would be how you two know each other and how we're at where we are today.
So, I mean, that's kind of interesting. It started largely through the crypto community. Tristan was working on a green tech project that was looking for a fair amount of funding, and this was to do a waste to energy plant. Well, actually, multiple waste to energy projects. One in Romania, one in Australia, and then a pilot in America. But maybe Tristan, you want to dig into that a little bit and kind of like walk that one through.
Yeah, so that was an awesome opportunity. I got to work with an incredible scientist called Gary Price, who's very, very quite talented in the particulars of not just understanding some form of alchemy that the rest of us are going to need in a few years, but reducing it to a really quite effective factory that really takes into account factors like heat waste and stuff. So he's got a really brilliant mindset between chemistry to factory, and our biggest hurdles were funding and legislation. And I was looking around in my networks. I'm like, who's got the crypto community? This is going to shock no one for me to say this. There's some people that are really quite visionary. There are people that are really quite interested in what a developed world of fintech can do for people. And there are, believe it or not, some people real interested in shoving a shit ton of money in their pocket, regardless of what's a wise thing to do with it or where legislation's going. And I'm like, hey, Oz cares about the environment and has what looks like a pretty good track record here. Like this guy looks like the best person to approach with this. And trusting in a show of character paid off. Oz has got experience in not just the things that I thought were relevant, but he'd spent a great deal of time figuring out what it would be like to get one of these types of reactors functional in New York. And for the listeners at home, what a zero or low oxygen reaction is more or less, I'll put it in the dumbest terms possible. In order for you to burn a piece of trash, you need oxygen, right? You remove the oxygen from the environment, it can't burn. So when you heat it, the things that would normally combust and burn, they escape, and you get access to the gases that can be used to make energy cleanly, and you're just leaving the carbon over in a pure carbon form that can be put into soil to make it more fertile. So
But beyond that, you also turn part of the solids into something that's like a charcoal, and that becomes a briquette. And so between the gases and the briquettes, you can basically take anything that you have, waste, whether it's manure, human waste, waste solids, unrecyclable plastics, recyclable plastics, and even certain types of garbage. And all of this can be fed through that process of burning it in a low oxygen environment, turning it into these briquettes, and then running entire energy generation systems. And if you were to think about this, because people always look at me and they're like, politically, this shouldn't fit. And I'm like, I grew up as a kid in Pittsburgh, and my dad was in the steel industry and he was in coal. And we had to deal with acid rain. We had to deal with the fact that you couldn't hang your laundry outside because it would turn black from the soot coming from, all of these coal-fired plants. And it really should come down to excuse me, a focus on, can we have clean air, clean water, and clean living, like clean food. And a lot of that just comes back to the crux of this, which is energy. And if
Yeah.
we're able to, regardless of political parties, come up with energy solutions that, one, kind of help the traditional companies innovate and realize that, like, okay, well, we just continued burning coal, we'll make money, but maybe we can make a little bit more money by diversifying into solar, by looking at wind, but realistically looking at a lot of this waste to energy, which I think is
Mhm.
a real low hanging fruit opportunity for them. And then, there's the other aspects of clean tech that are emerging from this. Like, we've talked about what MIT's doing with these new ferrous batteries, where they could store gigawatts, literally,
Yeah.
on the grid, and just all of the new innovations that are there. And it's like the nature of industry and the want to satisfy quarterly earnings reports for your investors has really kind of left us in this quandary where we're having some trouble innovating. And I think the stagnation in between political parties, not just in the United States but globally, over, like, what are the best options, and who should we be talking to technologically, and how should we be building this, really kind of needs to be something that becomes like a policy solution. But that's where we started, and we're kind of two oddballs in this mix because we're both minorities. We both kind of have a slightly different upbringing from a lot of folks. We've dealt with a lot of ultra violence in our lives, and we focused on causes that we care about, and I think that's where the big synergy is, and that's where we just thought, hey, a conversation about this makes sense.
Yeah, it's good that
Yeah.
you brought that up because I was the from a politically compatible standpoint. The both of you obviously have very different backgrounds, and that's it's interesting to see how you've developed that friendship through this really turbulent. Or a couple of different, very turbulent industries and areas of expertise. And given that you are obviously different ages and have grown up on different sides of the planet, and yet have found yourselves here, what do you think it is that draws the two of you together in terms of what you can sort of look to achieve, what you want to work towards with each other?
Oh,
So,
huge
you want to
question.
start first?
Yeah, yeah. I'll say, like, one, like, there's a thing you'll find with a lot of people who don't fit within a convenient enough stereotype, is like,
Hmm.
for most people it's quite difficult, and it's something that fortunately I can say in countries where I have fit a lot of the right molds. Like in Australia, people don't know what a moldy nose or lips looks like. So unless I'm in Frankston or Southwest Sydney, people can't actually recognize whether or not I'm Maori. They're just like, oh, this guy might have an Italian grandparent or something. He goes different color in the sun. And in Australia, I managed to avoid this. I'll pat myself on the back, but in general, it's hard to avoid the cultural conditionings of where you're born into, right? And you're kind of given this easy mode run that's exacerbated by the fact that it can be quite difficult when you're born outside of those things. And so you'll find that people that are born outside of a lot of these stereotypes are naturally incentivized to sort of understand who around them can also see the failures of those conditionings, right? Like
Hmm.
in one lens, you'd go, "Oh, this is environmentalism. This sounds like lefty cuck bullshit. Where's your sense of self-interest?" But in another, if you're not protecting the quality of the air you fucking breathe, the water you fucking drink,
Hmm.
and the soil, your food, that's going to affect you and your children's hormone levels. If you're not interested in how these things work, what are you really conserving? Like you're gonna go conserve some more fictitious capital? Good job. Like,
Exactly.
whereas when you look at, like, at the energy scenario, I think there's something that's, it's quite nice, nicely both hemispheric when you go, hey, nuclear huge legislative issue, contentious issue to the public, and has massive amounts of complication to it. Great energy option, heaps of positives, heaps of potential negatives. And then you look at another thing, solar, wind, etc. Those things are sort of being innovated incrementally. So there's not a huge amount of money that can be turned around in a short period of time. Whereas with waste to energy, you're looking at two critical infrastructures to a society that need cleaning up, both energy, demand's going up,
And
supplies
waste.
not moving with it, and waste. So you're managing to advance a city more cost effectively from a government side, and you're dealing with a far more disruptive innovation on the investment side. And so the idea that this is like not conservative or red pilled enough is just low IQ takes. Like,
Yeah, and I mean, you speak to that, and it's like we met with the Department of Sanitation, we talked to folks in the De Blasio administration. We were told things like, this has to be operational for 5 years somewhere in the United States in a pilot mode before they'll even consider it. And when you consider the fact that New York City generates 50,000 tons of garbage on an annualized basis, and actually, I think it might even be more than that. But those are the last
it's
data
not
points
small.
that I had.
I remember that
It's
much
not
about
small.
the research.
We export our garbage to New Jersey and a couple other states, and I think some of it ends up overseas.
That's still not helping the Knicks, though, is it?
No, it's not helping. It's not helping the Knicks at all, and it's definitely not helping the Mets and the Yankees. But one of the things that I put forward to them, I said, look, if we're just able to take all of the plastic that you supposedly recycle, that in most cases just gets burned, and run it into this process, we could change the carting, which is the garbage trucks, and some of their relationships with different cities. We could centralize this. We could create jobs out of it. And we could create a lot of power resiliency, and a lot of this should be considered because we're shutting down a nuclear reactor mid-state, which is called Indian Point, and which is just south of West Point, the university, and also the city. And you're going to lose like somewhere between 1 to 3 gigawatts of capacity, right? And so what's replacing that? Like where's that energy coming from? Meanwhile, at the same time, we're generating all this garbage. We're not utilizing the technology innovations that are out there. You've got a lot of politicos that talk, a lot of hot talk, but it really just works out to be lipstick on the pig about actually fixing these things, and nothing changes. And I think that the delta here is that, like, look, I'm Gen X and Tristan is on that millennial Gen Z cusp, right? And there's more similarities generationally we have in between us in terms of, what we see as the need for change, what we see as a need for focus, and the fact that, we've both been pretty much inside of industry technologically for kind of as long as we can remember. I mean, I've got like a decade or two on Tristan, but the similarities in terms of perspective coming from different parts of the globe, coming from different ethnicities. I'm Arab and South Asian, and then also different, just different politics, different landscapes. Everything's different, but the similarities are really around the not just the understanding of like the complexities of identity, right? Because when you think Maori, I mean, most people go to like a Disney movie, or they'll think about some like Palomalu from the Steelers, or they'll mistake, and he's Samoan, by the way, he's not Maori, right? So they'll start mixing all this stuff together.
Yeah.
And then when you say Muslim, like we've got people from 77 countries in the United States alone, from like different majority Muslim countries, and everyone wants to paint us as a monolith who thinks the same. Everyone who tries to package people inside of like these terms like BIPOC and that sort of a thing, like it's just very limiting, and it doesn't advance the conversation, it doesn't advance understanding, it doesn't advance society. And so we thought, well, if we could take a stab at kind of the the content creation aspect of this, we could take, a run at some of these conversations. If we can open the doors to the understanding in between black and white, which is where, billions of us live, that isn't part of the conversation, that isn't something that gets more than lip service, that isn't something that the media does more than just say, here's another stereotype about those people, right? We could actually kind of start breaking down some of these walls, and we could start building more understanding. But then the bigger thing is, I work in policy, Tristan works on the investment side of things, and I advise a number of companies. The thought process here is maybe we can actually affect some change by really coming up with concrete solutions that make sense, presenting them, and seeing that, if there's the opportunity to engage a broader audience in kind of saying, hey, not only does that make sense, but maybe we should start raising those issues, because that's the only thing that seems to work with politicos, whether they're Democrat or Republican or even independent, whether they're right-leaning or left-leaning internationally. And this goes from America to Australia and even in the EU and other countries around the globe. So that's kind of where we started.
Yeah, no, honestly, like it's incredible when you come at investment or at policy with the attitude of how am I going to honorably add a plus sum contribution to humanity, and what's in the way. When you're approaching these things with the attitude you should have, I think it quite naturally draws you to notice the same solutions and inefficiencies as well. Like it's just a more microcosmic equivalent of Oz and I living outside of regular stereotypable boxes, and therefore quite naturally noticing where those don't fit as well. And I think it's interesting because I found that the way people interact with the internet has a huge deal to do with like their exposure to non-internet and internet, therefore providing a context to it. Like what I've seen in the hacking communities is that a lot of the kids who grew up with iPads, like they don't really think much about like the fact that there's such thing as an app or an operating system. Like these words are just jargon, and the button brings them their Uber Eats. And like I can relate to that a little bit because that's how TVs were to me. I didn't know how the fucking satellite worked. Like I was never there when that got installed. I was there when the internet got installed and it got upgraded, and I got exposed to the idea of with and without. And so I think that that cusp that I'm on has given me a weird ability to relate to people a bit older who were involved in tech and watched the introduction of these elements. Because I'd say from what I've noticed, it's about 1991 to 1996 that have like vivid memories all the way up to say 14, 15 years old of for us, like what like Messenger, Facebook, and Instagram is now. That combo used to be like MSN Messenger or AOL and
or Zanga.
Yeah. And so seeing like the steps of those developments and the way that they've come to affect the organization of just humans gives not just a sense of perspective but also a sense of responsibility, right? Because like to those who don't understand that there is something going on behind that tapestry, like oftentimes it's like, well shit, like there's a long way to go in terms of us, I think, thinking like relevantly, like thinking relevantly to the time and the things that are happening. It's hard for them to notice it, right? Because they were born into a car going 100 miles per hour. They didn't get into a car that accelerated to 100 miles per hour. So like their accelerometers are all wacky. Their sense of momentum is without context. And it's really alarming to me to see like like 13 to 18-year-olds now, like they don't have a healthy sense of rebellion or test in them. they've got a really cynical apathy because
Hmm.
they were just born into a world where they're like, oh, apparently this whole thing's sinking. Better get drunk on this Titanic. Whereas,
But I would add to that, right? So there's that, and you've always had mixtures of that. But kind of think about this. Like we had Web 1, which was the internet,
yeah,
and the same type of policy problems we had then we're having now. Before, they didn't understand it. They either wanted to kill it or tax it, right? And there was all these arguments for internet tax, and we've got all of these decentralized taxes for different states that people who are selling on the internet have to adhere to. And you see this most clearly in Amazon because you're taxed on certain things in different rates at different domiciles, but depending on where you live. And in some countries you have VAT, in some places you just have state tax, in some places you have other levies that are thrown on top of there, and it gets more expensive. But Web 2 was kind of that migration from like, all right, well, it's now on the internet, and now what we're doing is we're stapling the community aspect to it in a more formalized way, and we're allowing you to create content. And there was a big movement, which was the commercialization of that content to the detriment of a lot of the content creators, right? Because you look at the BuzzFeeds and the Vices and a lot of these other outlets that were out there. They initially started paying people pretty well. They started moving away from that. It then went to freelance writers, and then there's a lot of user generated content. Huffington Post is, I think, the most egregious example of that. And it's no one's really being paid to do this stuff. And now we're into Web 3, which is like Web 1 again, where you have the internet, you have community, you have advanced methods of commerce and finance that are coming from blockchain. But instead of it just being like this two-dimensional thing that was the internet, or this two-dimensional thing that was social, where you had video, you had text, you had chat feeds, you had all this stuff, it's now three-dimensional, right? So now what you're doing is you're looking at something that has this whole component of Web 3, which is the metaverse and blockchain and decentralized finance and things to it. But you don't have the wherewithal of a lot of companies to make the change or make the jumps that they should be. And I think that kind of feeds into where you're going with a lot of this in terms of like the apathy and the lack of understanding and that sort of a thing. I was born pre-internet and I grew up pre-internet. You remember times that are roughly pre-internet, but you were young. Everyone who is ostensibly Generation Z, or I would say Generation Alpha, which is right behind them, they grew up fully inside of the web, right? It was everywhere. Social media was everywhere. They don't even have their first birthday, but there's pictures and documentation of them online, whether that's Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat or Weibo or TikTok or one of the 100 other platforms that are out there. And in a lot of senses, their right to privacy, their right to identity, their right to a lot of other things
yes,
have been have kind of been limited. And there's a portion, I think, of Generation Z that's looking at this from the perspective, which is really your generation, and you can speak more to this, but it's that some of that needs to be taken back. And then at the same point in time, you've got that ongoing interesting aspect of multiple cycles. Like we have 100-year cycle of war and disease that hit us with COVID. We've got about a 20-year boom cycle, which we're moving into with the whole Web 3 thing. We've got a economic cycle of downturn based upon the fact that just all these banks and other organizations are over leveraged. And we've got a technological cycle, which is now pushing the same way the Industrial Revolution changed everything in terms of manufacturing and power generation and whatnot, into this new industrial revolution. But the problem is that instead of it just being like Andrew Carnegie making steel and Ford making cars and a couple other people making certain things, it's literally hundreds and hundreds of categories of things. Everything from agriculture to battery storage to what we're talking about, waste to energy, to the internet, to Web3, to space technology. and it's huge. And so when you think about like before like 99 2000, we could talk about things and you kind of encapsulate the whole of the internet. Nowadays, when you start talking about these things, you're really only talking about that much, and it's about yay broad, and that's bigger than the screen.
I think it's probably impossible to grasp the impact that these changes are having on little kids.
Well, let me tell you.
Mhm.
Let me dump a couple factors. Like we don't have answers to these questions, but let me tell you. Like I'll give you a couple questions that also multiply with one another. You'll see how exponentially cooked this gets. Consider the fact that like between 3 and 8, I believe, um, you're forming the concept of what an identity is and means to your society. And then between 8 and 13, you're routinizing these things. So the human in those stages is then coming to try and routinize this as it goes into puberty, where its next set of challenges is going to come up. And that's when you deal with like testosterone rising, the orbito-prefrontal cortex in males. This is sort of when they start like, normally they in previous generations, this is when they used to start punching each other and stuff, right? They're starting to deal with a more adult version of physiology, an adult pain threshold, an adult, well, a young person, basically an adult on steroids level of recovery. And then in that, they normally find like where they sat within those particular pecking orders. Then between 19 and 24 through most of history, they would organize based upon these things that they've then built as they've got a more well-formed brain. They've had mentors as, you know, kings, warriors, magicians, and lovers, and then they've sort of come to accept their responsibility as the young ones that can carry out the legwork. And then there'd be quite a lot of like cleansing of corruption and such between 19 and 24. They're proving their honor and whatnot. And now, what are they doing? They're on like they're doing none of this at all.
You know what they're doing, Tristan?
Their hormone levels are disrupted by the standards of waste management, getting more and more insufficient, by agriculture getting more and more screwed with. Finance is getting dragged in increasingly extrinsic cycles where like for example, we're dealing with like massive issues of fictitious capital, and like in terms of the inefficiencies of investment and technology, like you guys got to consider how much there is like just young kids chasing unicorns out in Silicon Valley, hoping that their next tech product's going to be something that makes a shit ton of money in 5 years, instead of people paying attention to the Benner cycle and wanting to contribute to agriculture and wanting to get even richer and more stable in a way that serves society more over 10 years. They don't want that. No.
Yeah.
They've just been shoved in a locker for their whole childhood with various forms of power that don't connect well with those hormonal systems that are then thrown off. So we've got so many things out of whack, and these kids are consuming digital crack. As far as
well, then add the last factor to that, which is that we have overprescribed medication to children and adults for everything over the course of now 25 or 30 years, and that's affected the water table, right? So in New York, there's so much there's so much in terms of like hormone affecting drugs, which are birth control, but there's also a lot coming from antidepressants and whatnot that has entered the water table, that it's affecting the genders of fish. Like they're literally changing genders. And so you have to think that if people aren't drinking like 10-stage filtered water and it's just tap water in their ecosystem, and they're consuming, you know, a lot of processed sugar and processed carbohydrates and that sort of a thing, what you're doing is you're kind of dumbing people down. You're giving them stuff that's not necessarily as healthy as it used to be, and you're forcing them at very young ages into these data ecosystems, which are social media, but where they're forced to compete. And you know, you think about the cyberbullying and the fact that we now have like it's just a regular basis where there's like 12 or 14-year-old girls that are committing suicide because of the rampant cyberbullying that goes on online, and the fact that it's become a little primal, I guess you could say, in terms of how a lot of the interactions are online, because anything that you could say, if someone has a stereotype of you, they're going to have some sort of weird visceral response to it, right?
Well,
They don't see you as multidimensional anymore.
yeah, and it's not just the one guy at school that calls them that name. It's the fact that if you ever looked over their shoulder, like I've seen the crap that gets fed to you know, younger kids in my family. I'm like, oh yeah, what's it like? What's their YouTube suggesting them? And like I had to sit one of them down and go like, okay, you know I'm a basketballer, right? Yes, Tristan, where's this going? I'm like, okay, so let me show you my Instagram. I open it, boom. It's all going to be a bunch of like a bunch of things I'm not, right? Like I'm a
Mm-hmm.
6'3" mixed race shooter. So all it's going to show me is like guys who are shorter than me who are built like track and field athletes that can jump as high as I never will be able to physiologically. And then it'll
Mm-hmm.
show me a bunch of guys who are 6'8" plus who are playing, you know, post moves and such that I'll never get to use in a high level game. And I'm like, so looking at this, you'd probably assume that there's not that many interesting 6'3" green-eyed half-cast shooters out there, is there? And they're like, yeah, that's what you'd think. I'd be like, okay, well, there's this guy called Steph Curry who might be, you know, somewhat of a deal in the NBA. Like the, you know, probably
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
yeah, like the biggest champion of the past decade literally fits my description, and you'll never see him on my newsfeed because it would feed me the idea that I'm enough. Whereas if it feeds me all the things I can never be, then as soon as you call me, oh, you're a white combo guard, I feel limited. I get upset. And then what are you going to see on my feed? Advertisements for supplements, mass gainer. I'm like, this algorithm still doesn't understand what the equilibrium is of an athlete at each ideal BMI. It's good to know I'm still ahead of these types of things in some places. But like, it's not just the fact that like the kids are getting hostile with one another. It's that the leverage of hostility is getting multiplied by how many billion data transactions each half hour? Like,
Well,
And
if you
it's
think
not
about
even
this and you want to put it in a historical context, I just want to throw this in, and I'll defer to you.
go for it.
But we basically have taken the intellectual equivalent of Cosmopolitan magazine quizzes, and we've limited the exposure that people have in terms of their feeds to that type of content. And then if you look at what's been going on in Twitter for the past like couple of months, we're now finding out that there's been algorithmic manipulation. There's manipulation based upon how they have you identified politically. There's manipulation in Facebook. There's manipulation in Instagram. So you are, instead of you actually having the ability to digest a broader base of content organically, the only organic option that you have through most of the content consumption channels that are available to you, the socials, YouTube, other video platforms, really kind of becomes kind of narrowed. And I think that echoes your point, right?
Mm.
Is that it's only giving you like this much when that much is available. And that starts to change people's opinions, that starts to limit people's perspectives. And when it becomes repetitious, specifically when it's to race or gender or identity or really origin for folks like us, it just kind of doubles down in stereotypes that already exist, and it doesn't really help society, and it doesn't grow anyone, and it makes us less than what we should be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and the thing, what I was going to say, and I think it ties into that too, is that aside from the hostility associated with what you were talking about, Tristan, is the level of influence that these tech companies and the things that kids are being exposed to on social media generally. Like you mentioned, between the ages of 3 and 8, that children discover their identity and who they
No,
who
no,
they
no,
are.
no, no. That's when the human brain is trying to understand how identity functions
Right.
in your
Right.
society,
So
right? Like
so
historically, there's been different cultures where, you know, when the medicine man puts on the mask, he's got a different name, he's got different rules, he's going to treat you differently. Like
okay.
we're trying to we're at that stage of figuring things out between 3 to 8. So those
Mhm.
those machines are capable of more or less programming your idea of how real you have to be.
Well, and
If you get what I mean.
that's
So they get to push that level of consumerist framing on how a human should live their life in an extra level of insidiousness.
well. Here's an example of the influence that has on behavior. There was a kid who got in trouble, fucked up in some way, and was in trouble with his parents. And his parents, I think it was his dad, went onto his phone and found a video that the 4-year-old had recorded on the dad's phone. I hadn't uploaded it or anything like that, but it was an apology video that he'd filmed of himself, in the same way that, because he'd obviously seen people who'd
Mhm.
fucked up and posted apology videos online, and so he's like emulated that because he felt guilty, and it's influenced his behavior to such a degree that was his
About,
approach.
about what? Did he make an apology video announcement for drawing dicks on the wall in crayon?
Yeah,
What happened?
something like that. It had to have been
Or,
drawing
or
dicks
it's
on the
this
wall.
performative stuff. No, think about this performative stuff, right? Where, we understand that racism is a problem, and it's a much broader problem than just a black-white problem. But all of a sudden, you had a bunch of people doing performative apologies to black people in different communities, and I'm like,
Oh,
okay, did you solve the issue of the digital divide? Did you solve the issue of how, people want to be treated with dignity? Did you solve the issue of race relations? Did you solve anything? No. You did something performative. You got a bunch of likes. You're starting to tell people that, like, I'm a good person for this and that. But what's the difference in between that and, like, the person that comes into my community in Harlem, to volunteer at a food shelter once a year for one day, and say that they've contributed as much as possible, and gloat in it, versus folks like us that are working on an ongoing basis to try and figure out, like, can we get more food to you know to food distribution centers? Can we do more in terms of streamlining the process by which people have to go and get, like, aid and subsidies if they need it? And then,
yep.
more of, like, just consider what you and I have had to go through in the past couple of years. I mean, we both had chronic health issues. I'm about 94% getting through cancer, and I'm still dealing with stupid questions like, well, when's your cancer going to be done? And I'm like, it's not like cooking an egg. It's like, I can't
How
just
many
say
gigs per
7
second?
minutes.
How,
Yeah. It's not like transferring a movie online. And it practically bankrupted me. And it's by the grace of God I've had the ability to consult while I was lying in bed, and I still have good days and bad days. But a lot of other people that are in the same situation have to have some sort of a safety net, and there has to be a balance in between a perspective of very small government, a social safety net, and the opposite, which is very large government. But there doesn't seem to be a want for any kind of a discussion on that. And one of the things, I'm going to point this out, and I'll get a lot of crap for this, but as
Let's go.
a Republican district leader in Harlem, and as an American Muslim, and as a minority living in this community, looking at other states where fellow conservatives don't understand the need for food subsidies for children, but they themselves get subsidized with free dinner inside of their legislatures, like, practically every other night, right? And free meals and free this and free that. It just shows that there's this huge disconnect in between the haves and the have-nots. And there's a lack of understanding of constituents, and that needs to be fixed. But it's not just a conservative problem. It's a problem in democratic cities as well, because in many cases, funding will be cut, funding will be reallocated, or funding will be mismanaged. And that's where technologically we've talked about blockchain solutions and a variety of other things that could be brought to bear that could kind of clean this stuff up. But you're dealing with bad policy, a lack of understanding of a lot of our legislators, an age gap, right? Like in our Congress, I don't know how it is in your parliament, but in Congress, there are more members of the Great War generation, not boomers, Great War, preceding the boomer generation, than there are millennials, Gen Z, and Gen X combined. And,
Yeah, wow.
and that kind of tells you something, and I assume it to be kind of the same thing in Australia and many of the other Commonwealth countries. And those are all the countries that, are inside of this large trade pact with Britain. And we'll leave it at that, as opposed to explaining what that is, because that could take half an hour. And it also seems to be the same way in some European countries. Some of the Nordic countries, it seems to be changing. But there just seems to be a lack of understanding of like what is required to stimulate local economies when you've had a massive technological shift, when you've had a split from, the military industrial complex and the civilian industrial complex, when you've had a secondary shift in terms of technology splitting in multiple veins, that like it's not all coupled together the way it was 20 years ago. And the fact that simple macroeconomics and microeconomics don't seem to be things that any of these folks are really interested in. And that's across the aisle.
Yeah, definitely. I want to talk about something that Tristan mentioned a little bit earlier in low oxygen reactors, because I know that obviously between the two of you got a shared interest in clean energy and clean tech. And obviously there was that brief explanation as to what they are. So, what is the work that you're doing in that space? What are you looking at the moment?
Trying to raise roughly $300 million to get behind a couple of approved locations for running one of those, and looking at how that space between trash and energy is really where, like, when you hear about the concept of circular economics, it's a really difficult thing to do when you're looking at that as its own mammoth to slay. But this is also the spear you need to slay the mammoth known as a circular economy. So it's a worthy Herculean task, even though it's a pain in the ass, because getting a hold of that trash and being able to produce energy out of it also allows a lot of other things, like creating construction materials and raw materials for furniture or consumer goods, to be made in a make-to-order kind of model. Off the back of it, because we know that it's going to have value in energy. People are going to need energy, but if you've got a hold of all of this equipment and it's making turnover, and you're getting cash flow both on the side of dealing with the trash and then also on the side of whatever you're making out of it, then you can instantly offer people the ability to create orders. So I'm working with builder brokers who are, large scale SEO lock-off experts, who I can see being useful city by city in delivering these materials and getting them into markets. But the whole thing really comes down to to me, right? I'm not going to give you a normal answer an investor would, right? An investor is going to be interested more case by case than I am in understanding how to scale this all the way to the end, which is really my role in terms of being useful to other people on the investment side of the fence, and making sure that I maximize their opportunity. And the biggest struggle is, like Oz said, you kind of have to go somewhere that accepts more primordial or chaotic technological examples, so that you can give more empirical proof of how they work in practice. to people who honestly are generally quite apathetic. Like it's like part of the difficulty is finding people that will really click with the idea of pushing these envelopes, right?
Hmm.
Because finding someone who's willing to take a massive risk on, say, finding the R factor of a construction material, where they're finding out whether or not this material can even hold heat acceptably. Like there's not that many people that are excited technologists who
Right.
also want to throw that money at something that like that's a boring ass thing. That's really boring when you isolate it as the insulation level of this particular polymer that uses
Right.
pyrolyzed trash. Like people are asleep by the time you've gotten halfway through that. And so it's
But then there's the other side of it, right? So the other side of it is that we deal with these idiotic bureaucracies that really prevent us from moving this forward. And in New
yeah.
York, it's a democratic establishment that doesn't want to change. And they don't understand like the intrinsic overall value of this. If you set up kind of a hub, okay, that's a waste to energy hub, you are immediately impacting all of this garbage that's created on a daily basis. You could be impacting the solids that are taken out of wastewater treatment, right? Which is, in essence, that has to be either turned into some sort of landfill or compostable material, and it has to be cleaned up before you do something with it because it's human waste. But in this case, it could be burned in a low oxygen environment, turned into briquettes, turned into fuel. But the beauty of this system, of it starting in the center, and the reason why I keep putting my hands up like this, is that you could build kind of extensions off of this, right? And if you add a couple of chemical compounding systems, you can immediately create ammonia. And people go, well, why do you need ammonia? Well, all of your fertilizer is ammonia.
Oh,
And then
oh,
from
sorry,
the
sorry.
ammonia,
Sorry, one fact people should know. The human population was 1 billion before the Haber-Bosch ammonia process. So, like 5 out of 6 or 7 people only exist because of ammonia. People don't realize that this is like that level of building block to what we currently call life.
right.
I wanted,
And
sorry
then
to
and then if
interject on that.
you add another chemical process, you can now create urea. And that's used in everything from practically every every product that you have in your bathroom that's made by Unilever or one of these large companies. It's used in preservatives and foodstuffs, but it's also used in things like making diesel fuel. It has hundreds of thousands of applications that are absolutely necessary for industry and for business. And with the war in Ukraine, we've seen huge, like, decimation of the ammonia generation and the urea generation capacities of Ukraine, but then also the ability for like most of the world to buy it from them. And if you think about where we need to be on a country by country basis, we need to have energy sustainability and supportability, but we also need to not be affected by wars in other countries really kind of running ramshackle on our supply chains. And that's what's happened in pretty much every westernized country through COVID and through the Ukraine war. And it's something weirdly simple, oddly complex, waste focused, but it could literally revolutionize how energy companies operate. And then if you start taking from tech transfer offices and university systems, and then also the stuff that's coming from like government grants, and start commercializing things in an effective manner, but really opening the doors to bring technology companies that are building this stuff. Like there's a ton of stuff coming out of Carnegie Mellon and MIT, right? But getting the funding into that, which is what Tristan is working through now, and that I've been involved in for over a decade, it's complicated. And
Yeah.
then once
Oh,
you've proven it out, you really have to get people to buy into that idea. It's
it's
like having 100 Andrew Carnegie's trying to get started, but people don't understand steel.
Yeah. Oh, that's a very good way of putting it. And it also like it just sets off a lot of hilarious like psychological and ego traps when you're tapping a guy on the shoulder who's, you know, mentally in the yacht club 23 hours a day, and you're like, hey, I got this mad way to make you money. And he's like, yeah, this is great. And then at some point, he's like, hey, this fixes the environment. Are you drinking Kool-Aid? And they're like, it's hilarious how, like, I'm like, look, man, I know that the world runs on money. I give a fuck about the environment. I'm doing everything I can to take something that's interesting to like manic entrepreneurs and like Asperger's level scientists. And then I'm trying to
Yep.
tap a dude on the shoulder who's really, really interested in what complaint he can make about his awesome steak today. And
Mhm.
he realizes halfway through I'm asking him to save a continent, and he's just like, are you a hippie? Are you a spook? What the fuck is going on here? Like, I've had guys lose their minds just from being like, hang on, what's going on here? And also, how do you know this under 30? I'm freaked out. And I'm like, well, you backed me in a corner. The only thing I can tell you is I've got access to the same Google as you, and you're a fucking idiot. Sorry. Like,
But you know where that stems from. That stems from the fact that if you there's and I've seen this in the music industry when I was there. I've seen this in finance. I've seen this in technology. If there's not a reason for them to change, they're not going to, because change costs money. Change impacts what they're going to be able to return in terms of their quarterly earnings to their shareholders, and it longer term impacts the time frame they're going to have to recoup those investments and really show yield again. And because we haven't changed the macroeconomic constraints inside of any of our industries, and not even in any of our traditional exchanges, right? From New York to to London to Germany, to, we'll just keep going around the world. But the the thing that needs to happen to really fix this is if there is a government package that is a mixture of grants, tax incentives, location incentives, and that has to be coupled with policy that makes sure that it's going to last more than one presidential term. Because that's the other thing they're terrified about, is that, like, what if I put a couple hundred million into this and then that guy gets out of office and this guy gets into office, and they're like, no. And with the HBCUs that Trump funded, we saw one problem with Biden cutting the funding, but then the other problem that we had was like border security contracts and a lot of these other things, like stuff that was ramped up got ramped down. And with the Green New Deal, it scares the living piss out of people because, one, it doesn't have effective bipartisan support, and two, at the base level of it, you could scream like Greta Thunberg all you want all day long. But if you're not bringing something to the table that is going to help all of these traditional energy companies transform themselves internally to the new technology over a course of whatever that is, 5, 10, 15 years, and show them that there's a methodology by which they will be returning revenues and dividends within, call it like 3 to 4 quarters, all of those CEOs are going to be out of their jobs. Most of the leadership is going to be out of their jobs. And that's the unfortunate nature of the beast. And because we don't have people thinking in the context of, well, if we were to fix the macroeconomics of this, plus all of those government policy pieces, and make sure that it's got some extensibility to it, people would buy into it. But if none of that's there's no reason for these companies, unfortunately, to change from burning coal to even think about gasification, which is much cleaner, and to do anything more than flare the gas. I mean, natural gas was being burned off of wellheads. But there's 5,000 wellheads in Texas alone that were doing it, and the only thing that made people cap it and start utilizing it is the fact that they could liquefy it and sell it to Europe now at a really, really high rate. Because before, it was too expensive just to get the infrastructure out there to sell it, because you couldn't sell it at a fair price. And these are the things that no one discusses. It doesn't come up on CNN. It doesn't come up on Fox. I'll give you both extremes, because they're more interested in the sound bites and they're not interested in the solutions.
Oh yeah, and the game theory economically is completely on drugs as well. Like,
Mhm.
the like unironic statement I heard when I started pitching large scale full blown solutions. Like I'm talking solving a country's carbon issues X2 at a time and shifting their whole chessboard around in a very awesome
Mhm.
way for some people. And when I spoke to people in in particular like a few like angel investment communities, like they didn't mean
Mhm.
it with malice to me. They were just like the ones I speak to. I mean, obviously by now they've like my loud mouth has helped me find out which ones are worth talking to or not. But
Right.
even they're like, hey Tristan, like you need to go find a bespoke solution at the corporate level because these people who should be interested in disrupting this are heavily invested in carbon portfolios and they're scared about what would happen if you introduce this many credits to the market or rendered the market a solved problem. And so then all the way up into a lot of people playing the theory on the legislative end, they're like, well, we'd rather see you wait until we accept that we need to have proper accountability for inputs and outputs of gases in a country. We don't want to see the problem solved until after that, because then we're losing our seat at this poker table. And I'm just like, yo, this
But
poker
there's
table
an
is your
easy
world.
answer for that. There's an easy answer for that, and I think they overlook it because, again, it's tied into the banking system, it's tied into lines of credit, it's tied into the fact that many of these companies are overextended in many ways. It just baffles. I'll just give you a statistic, okay? When I was consulting with General Electric, and this was decades ago, and I was doing Six Sigma stuff, I just remember one of the VPs told me that they operated at 31% efficiency. Okay, so if you consider it's an 8-hour day, what's 31% of that? That's you come in, you answer some emails, you take a couple of meetings, but by lunch you've basically fucked off, which basically means that you only have like 2.5 hours of productivity a day, and they're making billions of dollars in 2.5 hours of productivity effectively a day. And they were saying that if they could raise the productivity just 1%, that equated to somewhere between 10 million to 100 million per division. Okay. And so if you think about the fact that most of these large corporations operate with a significant degree of entropy, and they're considering this only from the perspective of carbon credits, and they like utilization of carbon credits because what it does is it gives them a green aspect to this. You could actually change the paradigm by packaging the credits with a credit to tax transfer initiative, meaning that now the credits could be utilized in a manner and fashion with government to abate taxes. And this is a bigger thing in Australia than it is here because your tax system is completely different than ours and a lot more onerous. But that type of methodology could easily be extruded to parts of Europe, the rest of the world, and emerging economies.
Right.
And things like
Yeah.
that are really, those could be the drivers to say, hey, listen, we'll give you this, but what you have to do is you have to sign up to do these types of technology pilots,
Yes.
and we'll
Yes.
we'll do a public-private partnership with you to build it. And what we'd like you to do is to become an industry segment leader in this, as
Yeah.
we'd like to transition out of this full carbon economy into this new economy. And I'll tell you, we've done this in our lifetime, and everyone forgets about this. From 1981 to about 1999, America had this huge problem with acid rain. Okay. And acid rain was solved by a mixture of technology, working with companies, a bit of university, government support, and policy. And so, if we could do it to the point and degree that acid rain isn't even an issue or a consideration anymore, and it's not called acid rain anymore, it's called something like sulfur or sulfated rain, and it's like an SO4, you know, uh, chemical formula inside of like what
I
the
mean, it
rain is.
feels more distant and sciencey than telling people it's raining acid.
Yeah, because they just keep changing the terms on this stuff. But if you were to think about how we did that, and you were to say, all right, well, you want to go green, well, we could go that way because even when I was at The Economist, right, we worked with Chevron. We built this game called Energyville. It's a video game. And it was built on economist data, and it talked about, well, what will it take to transition fully to green? And there wasn't a scenario, and you could play with all the different types of energy to power a city. And a city had a consumption of like a gigawatt. And then it would incrementally grow the city over years. But what you found out was you had to have some mixture of fossil fuels and some mixture of green, and you could eventually transition to green. Okay. And this is outside of the whole EV issue, because there's slave labor issues with that, and there's mining issues with that, and there's runoff issues. There's a whole ton of other issues. So let's take that and like push that over here.
Yeah.
Right.
It's a worse game.
But if we're just talking about energy, and we're talking about upgrading the grid, and we're talking about transitioning these companies, we did it for acid rain. We had the metal to do it. And we did it through, in America, we did it through both Democratic and Republican administrations, in many cases, predominantly Republican administrations, right? It can be done here. It can be done in Australia. It can be done everywhere. And your biggest issue is all of the coal mining that they want to do on that reef, right? On the Great Barrier Reef, in addition to all of the coal mining that, because here's the thing, it's just cheap, and they have the methodology to do it. And realistically, they just have to throw machinery and labor at it. You don't have to really think about it. There's no big technology expense to this.
I've seen
right?
some pretty solid reports. Like let's imagine, I magically snapped my fingers and there was like a nuclear power plant somewhere close to Sydney. It's still just based on Australia's abundance of coal, it would still be 6 times cheaper per megawatt hour to just run on coal. And so in Australia, like I think like what you're talking about in terms of like, look, if you want a tax dodge portfolio option, here are some fucking good ones that solve the problem. Like that is like Australia is a perfect country for that kind of thing, because like so much of our land has the potential to be restored. And like stuff like the briquetting facility you're talking about, you put the carbon into the ground, you're literally going to be able to create like a positive spiral of regenerating the land and then sequestering more carbon, especially if you're doing something like hemp, or you're using a regenerative style of beef farming that doesn't use fodder that puts out methane. All these things are possible. And like it's incredible how many people on the left want to pat themselves on the back for supposedly caring about the environment when they haven't done.
But it's nothing more than greenwashing. I mean,
it is. Yeah, it is. It like, and it's like, it's just, I gotta be real. It is straight up narcissistic as fuck. Like, if you don't have the time to read about the boringness of the solutions, but you do have the time to hold someone up in traffic about how you're worried about the problem, I don't think you give a fuck about the problem. I don't think you give a flying fuck about it. And it's pretty amazing, because most of those people, they meet me and they're like, oh, this guy used the word money, he must not care about the environment. And I'm just like, yeah, cool. Like, yeah, go screech in traffic about it. Yeah. Excellent.
Speaking of money...
No, I think... So I just said that I want to end cap that. I think our focus here is that if we were to use the strategies of the past that have worked, and we were to bring those to the solutioning that's needed now, really all it takes is more sensibility, more focus, less politics, but also understanding that you got to help the companies change, because there's really no economic incentive for them to do it. And for each one of these industries, if you're talking about like, okay, well, what's the coal industry in Australia, right? It's probably several $100 billion. So if you've got a mountain that's several $100 billion, and you say, okay, well, I want you to convert to green, and I go, yeah, but the mountain for green is we're only going to make, a tenth of that. We're going to have to expend 3 times that in terms of R&D and transformation of business and transformation of hiring to get there. And it's going to take us an extended period of time. The answer is what we articulated, which is policy, government involvement, macro and economic changes, technology transfer through public-private partnerships, and then really working with companies to figure out exemplar companies that can lead in the space. And at the same time, empowering startups to create more jobs and to bring that to fruition, because they're the only ones who are crazy enough that are going to raise money to, you know, turn on giant solar ovens, or to turn on solar concentrators, or to build, you know, dramatically new power systems that are far more efficient than the existing power systems that are out there. But there seems to be a big disconnect between the left and corporate America, and I would say corporate anywhere in the world, corporate Australia. And there seems to be a lack of conversation in between the right and technologists to say, hey, you know, we had an industrial revolution once before. We could have a green revolution that would be equally as powerful in terms of transforming people's lives and raising the standard of living and doing all these other things. But it's going to require the mettle of working together.
Yeah, power sovereignty and food sovereignty are two of the biggest things classically conservative-minded people should be worried about. And so they've got to stop feeling like, oh, this smells like environmentalism, get me out of here, you know, and just accepting like the raw matters of strategy that do happen to be good for everyone as not necessarily being bad for the self. Like there's a sort of framing of economics as a negative sum competition in a lot of like conservative media, which is just not the right way to be approaching economics, even if it might be more wise in other areas. And on the left, there needs to be more of a recognition of like what's even a sane pace and style of disruption to ask for. Like, because your job in this whole thing is apparently to care about the people. So probably don't, you know, shrink the middle class in your process of trying to slay the energy dragon. Spend more time being progressive, progress the agriculture industry. If you care about the workers, think about the farmers a little bit more. Like
but not just think about the farmers.
You don't have to knock down an oil rig if you plant a few thousand hectares of hemp. We can all have our own little aesthetic
that has,
to
and
wear on
I completely
4chan.
agree with you, and that has its legal challenges to it in both Australia and America and in a variety of other countries. But I would say that the crux of this change needs to be a philosophical understanding that every single time America has changed, every single time Australia has changed, right, from, you know, a maritime economy to an industrial economy to now a technology economy, you can't depend on things like Silicon Valley to drive everything, because they become as nefarious as the CEO who's beholden to his quarterly earnings, because now it's an even more dangerous evil. It's the venture capitalist who wants their yield back, who wants their return on their investment, and they want it now faster and in different ways, and they're more willing to sell your technology and bastardize what you've created. You know, Google started out saying do no evil, and now they've got an AI product that's stealing information from Chat GPT, right? That doesn't work. I mean, like, what's your definition of evil here? Because that sounds a little evil to me. But at the same point in time, you know, they're not innovating in a way that's really affecting anything outside of their corporate purview. You know, they have greener data centers, they have a lot of this stuff, but guess who, the only people that it impacts is Google.
So what?
Yeah, well, a lot of those fund managers, they're just happy to be there, and they're just like, well, I should fail with what whoever above me is drinking in terms of Kool-Aid, so that I hide behind their cognitive dissonance instead of getting fired for lacking initiative. Like, it's like a lot of that stuff I look at, and I look at like what I've had access to, which I guess is like quite privileged because Australia is underfunded. So if you've got a good enough scientific vocabulary, like I've gotten access to stupidly great amounts of information just because of how easy it is to get your foot in the door here compared to what it is with, you know, a renowned innovator over there. But I just look at that shit and I'm just like, this sounds like a skill issue, guys. Like, you guys suck.
So what is it?
Well, then that goes to Sorry, Lucky, as you were.
I was going to ask what is it at the moment that each of you are um, most excited about in either technologically or politically in terms of advancement? What is something that gets you really excited in that space?
You go.
In Rhode Island, because we've tried working in New York for years, and I mean, I'm the head of the New York Blockchain Association, which is a legislatively lobbying body. You know, we're less like the meetups and that kind of stuff. That's the Blockchain Center and a few other organizations. But I've been working with Rhode Island since 2018, and we're currently working with their legislature. And we previously worked with Jessica De La Cruz and David Place, so bipartisan support. But we're primarily working with David Place, and it's again bipartisan support by talking to their speaker the other day, where we want to bring policy into place that can help with crowdfunding under the Jobs Act of 2012 that Obama created, by which you could use non-accredited investors to raise, you know, a couple 100,000 to a couple million for an initiative. But guess what that does? That creates businesses, that creates jobs. And that doesn't necessarily have to be something technological. That could be funding, you know, like a restaurant that has a really good business thesis in an area that's underserved. That could be putting in some sort of you know, a food distribution center or a supermarket in an area that there's a food desert. That could be a variety of things, right? But we're advancing blockchain policy, and we're advancing legislative efforts to try and make Rhode Island kind of like a better version of Wyoming, more crypto friendly, more blockchain friendly, more open for banks to come in and start working on kind of like sandboxes, so to speak. That I'm really excited about, and I think that's probably going to take a while for us to matriculate. But you know, if we build that, then there's dozens of states behind them that would say, hey, if this is massive economic invective for you. And what I like about Rhode Island is it's got a lot of the same statistics as we do in uptown New York City. Like, I have an effective unemployment rate of about 25% in Harlem. The same effective unemployment rate is in Providence, Rhode Island. We've got the same digital divide where, you know, we've got a ton of universities around us, but we have a population that really doesn't have access to either the government partnerships or government training or even industry sponsored training, right, to get them into those tech jobs. And in most cases, we're talking about minorities, we're talking about Black and brown people, right? And brown people look like me, brown people who are Latino, brown people who are Asian, brown people who are South Asian, you know, just and brown people who are Latin American. So
a lot of people
so
who
those
don't
two.
see like the heavy urbanization of New York or understand it can't even begin to comprehend how serious it is to surround people with a concrete jungle where
Mhm.
construction requires a very different level and style of training, and the manual labor is effectively closed off to people who are then not really even given the basic access to
Mhm.
contribute to the digital world. Like, like you can get as you know, 4chan dwelling Ben Shapiro fan as you'd like about crime statistics, but like, brother, your choices there are starvation and crime. Like, what are you
I mean,
like? You
and with a
gotta
lot of
actually support these communities. It's
with a
not
lot of the
touchy do so.
democratic policies that we have, it's just led to decline. I'm not shitting on the Democrats. I'm just saying that, like, look, there's good policy and there's bad policy. And with the leadership that we've had a lot of bad policy in New York, where we're looking at using Rhode Island as an exemplar, is that in a bipartisan way, with support of both Democrats and Republicans, maybe we can try something that's different and build something that's based upon what's worked in university, what's worked with university data studies on building these communities, and what we know from the Department of Labor, what I know from IQ4, which is, you know, an organization that seeks to take underprivileged folks and bring them into technology jobs,
Mhm.
mostly in cybersecurity. Hat tip to our sponsor, and you know, those things need to change to really encompass a vision that I think allows for the American people to level themselves up.
Mm.
And part of this is potentially going to be gamifying it. And then it leads me to my other project, which is Parallel Worlds. And so we're
Sorry,
working with a
before you
company.
leave that one, I've got a question.
Mhm.
Would you say that that type of community outreach and upskilling is where the future of vertical farming is really going to come from in your country?
It can. The problem with vertical farms is that our build cost in New York is $1,400 a square foot.
Yeah.
And vertical farms, for them to exist in cityscapes across any part of the land, really need to be in places that are in a lower cost environment. So I would say you could put the vertical farms like on the outskirts of Queens, maybe, most likely outside of New York City, like anywhere that's reasonably upstate, where your build
Right.
costs drop from that to say like a couple $100 a square foot. But then they just need to be tied into the infrastructure that would feed into the transportation hub, that's at the bottom of the Bronx, that feeds all five boroughs, that serves as the distribution of food and really most resources to millions and millions of people, effectively about 17.1 million people in the metropolitan service area. Um, Things like that would work. The challenge that you have with vertical farming really kind of stems into utilization of, like, what lights are you using pink light or using a multi-spectrum light, that sort of a thing. The cost per square foot of operation to actually raise whatever it is, and most of the vertical farms in New York City that do exist are doing things like microgreens and chef choice staples and things like that they can sell at a much higher price per
Mhm.
pound, that are being used in restaurants. So the food deserts, those types of things are still there. I think it could be a huge solution, but again, it's another industry that's going to need some sort of governmental public private partnership and some sort of subsidy to get these things moving,
Yeah, and
because you could put
some celebrity chef who's interested in doing something real different.
yeah,
Yeah, that could be
exactly.
awesome.
And it can't be Rachel Ray. It has to be someone much bigger. Um,
Uncle Roger.
Get Uncle Roger in on it.
Uncle Roger only has 3 million subscribers right now. I don't think it's enough. You need someone
Push
bigger.
it,
I mean,
Uncle
if you
Roger.
brought like Uncle Roger would be good for something like that. But yeah, that's what I'm jazzed about right now. And then Parallel Worlds, which we're kind of trotting out at NFT NYC, we're going to be creating an actual digital twin environment of Manhattan, and we're going to start bringing that into a metaverse storyscape where people are effectively able to create three-dimensional content. Because the lamest thing right now about the metaverse is like, it's like, come here, buy our land, and it's like, after a couple of months, I'm like, well, what do I do with all this land? And they're like, the land's worth money. I'm like, no, it's virtual land in a virtual place that's only as valuable as what people's faith is in it, you know. And we saw this with a huge number of these companies that cratered and just like died out in the past couple of months. We saw this with like the land erosion that we had inside of the NFT and metaverse space. So trying to build something there technologically that makes a lot more sense, that really takes us to what I call Web 2.5, which is, we know all this Web 2 stuff, and the Web 3 stuff is interesting, but if you want to get the average consumer there, it has to not violate Fuller's law, which is 80% old, 20% new. And the problem with most of Web3 is, it's like the internet. It's 100% new. So you only get, if you have a bell curve, you really only get that 13% of early adopters that
Yeah.
jump into this kind of stuff. And everyone else stares at, like, did you bring a hyena to the party? Like, what the hell is that? Like, they're just confused. And so those are the two things that I'm kind of like jazzed about and pretty involved in right now.
Yeah.
And then just local food policy, a couple other things, and then we've got an interfaith project in the works where I'm trying to just turn it into cross faith, because if we can get better understanding inside of people of faith, focused in kind of an understanding of community and family and these types of things, and just the civic structures that really build successful and healthy communities, we can do better. We could do a lot better.
Yeah, great. We are way over time at this point, so I'm
Yeah,
wondering
well,
if
I need to talk about what excites me,
yeah,
fucker.
let's talk about
I,
what
Why don't
excites
you do what
Tristan.
excites you, and then you could trim me,
No, that's it's okay. Yeah, I'd like to. What if we run into what
no, it's
excites
fine.
Tristan, and then wrap it up. Call it there.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sweet.
So I'm really, really, really fucking interested in that circular economics thing, right? Because I mean, it should, like, survival shouldn't be like, crazy crazy high on the list in the consideration of this kind of thing. But like, I'm not just like scared of the stick. Like, the carrot here is fucking massive, right? Like, getting together something that's got such a raw, continuous intrinsic value that scales in like lockstep with the economy that it's installed within. That's also solving a problem that scales with the size of the city that's in. That can then also create a plus sum situation where I'm also managing to add agriculture and waste to construction materials. You're starting to get like a serious, like the thing Oz is talking about, where you're really looking at like a central like piece of what a sane modern economy might look like. I like, straight up, if anyone can find me something more similar to Joseph's step pyramid in history, like, I'll give you a foot rub. Like that, like this
I'll
is
take you up on that.
oh, like, no, seriously, like, good luck, good fucking luck. The implications of how it could stabilize, our relationship with the planet in a way that doesn't hold us back. Where the entire discussion around environmentalism usually feels like a chore, right? Like, it feels
Really?
like it straight up feels like someone's nagging you. Like, it's like there's, someone's EQ'd in 5% Greta Thunberg into every discussion everywhere about the thing. And it's like, nah, this is no different to just like, a creature managing to scale up and balance out its like gases between oxygen and CO2. Like, we're starting to understand, what's the lactic acid, what's the ATP of the
You maybe want to
interconnected human
boil
being.
that down for folks.
So
Yeah, because I don't know if everyone knows what adenosine triphosphate is.
yeah, no, real normal stuff. But like, what I'm saying is, like, it's comparable to an evolution of a species that sort of happens externally in humans in the form of things like an industrial revolution, right? Like, whales, if you're measuring hardware to hardware, whales are smarter than us. They don't write books. They don't externalize their information and externalize their innovations like we do. And this, I think, is a huge deal where, the good news is, like, if we don't get our shit together, we don't have to see it get much worse for much longer. And if we do get our shit together, it's a really, really bright future. And I'm super excited to see, the effects of, even if just a few places accept this. Like, it's going to be unbelievably awesome that I get to live out a good significant period of my life, hopefully, watching a society actually grow. Because like,
Right.
we haven't seen it for a while, and I don't know what it feels like. I know what it feels like standing in a field that's, just lost a crop, and I know what it's like standing in one that's about to be harvested and it's about to be good times around. Like,
and engage us online. We've got most of the socials pretty much set up, and we're going to be pushing this out through a couple of channels. And we're also looking for thought leaders and tastemakers inside of these spaces to join us. So if you'd like to be on, definitely hit us up. And this will be an interesting year.